On your prospect, welcome to RTB 2021 for July the 18th, 2021. We're marching through July. So we've got some great text for today. We've got Judges chapter 1. So entering into, I know this is you're gonna laugh at this. This is my favorite book in the in the Old Testament. And there's a reason for that. I'll describe it in a minute, but uh, it is just a phenomenal book, and I know you'll enjoy it. It's an entertaining book as well, but one with a very powerful message for today. Then we've got Acts 5, Matthew 28, and Jeremiah 14. Acts 5 and Matthew 28 we've talked about before, so I'll just hit some of the highlights for those. So Matthew 28, why don't we start with those, Matthew 28 and Acts 5. So Matthew 28, of course, is the story of the resurrection, and what a beautiful story this is. Oftentimes we focus on the resurrection, obviously around Easter, but it's really something as that we should celebrate every single day, every single week of the year. That's what we really do, because we as Christians gather on Sunday, and there's a reason why we gather on Sunday, and that's because of the resurrection, and because of the hope that we have in Christ, because of his victory over death. He was the first fruits of what we will one day experience, and it signified God's victory over this which humanity had brought upon themselves, this death, which is the product of sin. And of course, at the end of this chapter is, of course, the Great Commission. As I mentioned in my sermon the other day, quoting Chuck Swindoll, this is the Great Commission, not the Great Suggestion. What is the commission? The commission is, if you look at this, sometimes it's presented as a whole list of different commands, but really the main command in this text, the only command in this text, is to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the making of disciples is our command. So that is what we are to do in response to this hope that we have in the resurrection, is to go forth and make disciples of all nations. Of course, this again fits in with Matthew's emphasis as a Jewish former tax collector and disciple, writing to Jewish Christians. He's communicating that God's gospel is not just for the Jew, but also for the Gentile, and that includes the whole entire world, which is part of God's purposes from the very beginning. And of course, you have this wonderful assurance that even as we do go forward, we will face persecution, and therefore we need to have that knowledge that Christ is with us even to the end of the age and thereafter, right? Christ will always be with us. The presence of God is assured, even as Christ was God dwelling within us. He was God incarnate. He is going to be with us through his Spirit, and then we will be with him in the new heavens and the new earth for eternity. Acts 5 is a series of stories. Of course, we had the famous story of Ananias and Sapphira. If you want my comments on that, go back to the last RTB when I talked about that earlier in the year. And then you have the imprisonment and release of the early disciples as they are facing, Peter especially here is facing the high priest once again, and he says, we must obey God rather than men, verse 29, talking about how God had raised up Jesus. And Gamaliel responds by stating that, if this is from God, we're not going to be able to do anything about it. And it's somewhat prophetic on the part of this Pharisee named Gamaliel. And notice what happens as they go forward, making disciples, Matthew 28. They go out rejoicing because they can be considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. And how can they do that? With the knowledge that the Lord is with them always, even to the end of the age. So, Acts chapter 5. That brings us to Jeremiah 14, and we'll end with Judges. So Jeremiah 14, we've got several different texts. Again, this is Jeremiah's passages here, and it don't always fall in nice lines with the chapters. You have a lot of different messages that are being sent here. It begins with a prophecy that compares what Judah was about to experience with a drought, which of course would have been a covenant curse. They were experiencing these covenant curses for their iniquities. And because of that, they would have more covenant curses added to them. Verse 10, sword, famine, and pestilence. This is straight out of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 and Deuteronomy 32. The disciplinary measures of God when Israel went astray in their covenant relationship. Jeremiah responds in verses 7 through 9 by pleading with God to act on their behalf, pleading for his mercy. And yet God says, this discipline is coming upon them because of their covenant disobedience, their covenant infidelity. Then Jeremiah moves in verse 13 to talk about false prophets and kind of lays the fault at the feet of these false prophets who have led the people astray, and basically have said the way they've led them astray is by speaking in the name of the Lord and saying that the Lord's going to deliver us, when in fact he was not. So they were giving the people what they want to hear rather than what they needed to hear and what God wanted them to hear. And God tells them that he will hold those prophets to account. And then once again, there's kind of a lament at the end on the part of Jeremiah, verses 19 and following, again asking God to intercede and to come to their aid, saying that we hope in you, and you are the only one who has done all these things. So Jeremiah 14 brings us to Judges. So why do I love Judges so much? You probably heard me speak about this before, but let me just go over it again. I love Judges for, we'll say 4 different reasons. Number one, I love Judges because it was the first book that really showed me the beauty of the Old Testament. Really, where I caught the desire to study it more, and it was when I had a Hebrew exegesis class of the Book of Judges under my mentor Dan Block as a master's student, and is really where I caught the desire to study the Old Testament more. So that's one reason. It's a little bit nostalgic for me. Number two, you will not find a book in the Bible that speaks to the problems of the church more than this one in the Old Testament. The refrain that you find at the end of the book of Judges is, and they were all doing what was right in their own eyes. It's moral relativism. We think moral relativism is a modern thing, but this is something 1,500 years before the time of Christ, right? That was happening 1,300 years before the time of Christ. Number three, I love the book of, well, let me say one more thing about that. And that's the temptation for us as a church as well, right? As modern believers, we are tempted to do what's right in our own eyes. The other thing that you see in the book of Judges is this theme, as we'll see over and over again, of Canaanization, how Israel was becoming like the world around them. And these are the 2 main temptations of the church today: becoming like the world, compromising with the world, and doing what's right in their own eyes, not consulting with the Lord and following his will, but following what the world wants and what we think we want, right? So that's reason number 2. It's ability to speak to the church today. Reason number 3 why I love the book of Judges is because of how the structure works in the book, and I'll explain this more as we go through the book, to communicate the message. It is a tightly knit structure that communicates a very powerful message for today. And we'll talk about that more and more as we go. And then finally, I love the book of Judges because I don't think you will find a book that is more, you have more, you will not find a book with more literary artistry than the book of Judges. It is a fun book to read. So much can be said about this book of Judges that commends it. But here we have Judges 1. So the book of Judges is about, as I mentioned, the downward spiral of Israel towards Canaanization. And it's prophetic in that way, right? It's not just telling us a story. It's selected information to communicate a message. In other words, it's not just giving you history. It's giving you history to transform you as you read it. So it's showing the danger of this downward spiral towards becoming more and more like the Canaanites around you. Well, it starts out, of course, this whole story, this whole history. This book, by the way, is dealing with about 350 years of Israel's history, from the conquest, which is around 1400 BC, 1405, all the way down to about 1050 BC. So that's what 335 years or so is the amount of, 355 years. The amount of time, actually, it starts with Joshua's death, so about 335 years. And this whole period is a really dark period. It's a time where Israel is consistently doing what's right in their own eyes, right? They're going after these other gods. They're engaging in idolatry. They're engaging in rank paganism, and they're becoming like the Canaanites. But it doesn't start out that way. It starts out with, at the beginning of the book of Judges, Joshua dying, and then Israel wondering, well, what should we do now? Well, obviously they need to be continuing the conquest, but they're not knowing what to do. Part of that is because in Joshua 24, if you remember, when he puts his house in order, one of the things that Joshua doesn't do to put his house in order is he doesn't name a successor. So when Israel goes to continue the conquest, they don't know who's going to lead them after Joshua dies. Well, Judah steps up. But even Judah, they go out and they fight against Adonai-Bezek, and they end up cutting off his thumbs and big toes because that's what Adonai-Bezek did. And so they're ended up acting like this Canaanite king. But really, the whole message of Judges chapter 1 is Israel's failure in the holy world, failure in taking over the promised land. So even though this land was allotted to them, even though God was going to fight for them, because of their unfaithfulness to God, infidelity to God, because of their lack of faith, they were ultimately going to be not able to do so. And so they end up not driving out the Canaanites, and because they don't drive out the Canaanites, they end up living beside the Canaanites. So if you read down to chapter 1, verse 27, you have this long list of all the different failures on the part of the different tribes in driving out the Canaanites. And this sets up the rest of the book, because as they are not able to drive out the Canaanites, they end up acting like the Canaanites. So this it looks like history, but it's not history. It's telling why Israel is ending up where they're going to end up in this period of the Judges. And it acts and it serves as a warning to future generations not to have those same attitudes, not to go after the Canaanites, not to be like the world. And that's a good message for us today on this day, July 18th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.